Saving Private Ryan didn't just entertain people, it shook them. Not because it was dramatized violence, not because it was super stylized or artistic, it's because it was just brutal, unfiltered truth. And that's the power of cinema most movies today are too scared to tap into, because telling the truth, especially the ugly kind, it's risky, it's uncomfortable, and worst of all, it might not have the mass appeal to guarantee a successful box office. Steven Spielberg did not make this film to win awards. He made it because some stories demand honesty, even if it hurts, even if not many people might watch it because of the story subject. In this video, I want to present you with a question, using Saving Private Ryan as an example. What is violence in film actually for? Let's talk about the difference between shock and meaning. Toward the end of this video, I will explain how I have come to approach violence, not just for my viewing entertainment, but also for the type of stories I have told as an indie filmmaker. With Saving Private Ryan, something that I actually just found out in a recent article I was reading, what made this story more emotionally resonant was the fact that it was born from Spielberg's deep personal connection as the son of a World War II veteran and his lifelong fascination with his father's wartime stories. Saving Private Ryan's immediate impact was monumental, particularly on the very individuals whose experiences it sought to honor. Reports quickly surfaced of World War II veterans walking out of theaters. This reaction, however, was not a critique of inaccuracies or disrespect. The reason these seasoned soldiers could not resist the screening was the film's unprecedented, almost unbearable realism. For many veterans, Saving Private Ryan became an unexpected catalyst for confronting and sometimes even healing long-held trauma. We're going to watch a short clip about Steven Spielberg's, reasons as to why he decided to tell the Saving Private Ryan story the way he did, because he's told a few different war films, right? He's made a few, and why Saving Private Ryan was created the way it was created, especially with, the opening of the film being D-Day and how violent just everything was in that film. But to give you kind of a perspective, I pulled up 3 clips I want us to all listen to together of some of these D-Day veterans who are explaining a moment from their story. These are pulled from longer stories that they told, but this was a little sampler as to what some of these men experienced on the real day.
I had 2 stragglers. They didn't want to die, so they thought by staying with me, they'd be safe. Unfortunately, by staying with me, they were drawing fire from the hilts. The first guy got hit, ripped his stomach open. Fortunately, he lived. This guy lived. And the other guy that was 2 feet away from me, he was a red-headed kid. The machine gun took his helmet off and part of his brain, and part of it. And he was crying, "Help me, help me, help me." I had no morphine, I couldn't help him. So he fell at my feet, and he was crying, "Help me, help me, help me." I had nothing in my kit to help him. So the only thing I had was the Lord's Prayer. And I started praying, "Our Father who art in heaven." I never finished it. And he slumped down. I knew he was going to die. And I reached down, and I squeezed his hand. I want him to know that he wasn't alone. Then he died. He died. He was just a little boy. Just a little boy.
And I saw this kid with a radio on his back, and I said, "Ha, there's my savior." And I started to walk down towards him, probably maybe 25 or 30 yards. And he was coming up at me. We were probably separated by maybe 40 yards of land. And there was an overhead burst took place. It hit him, and it cut his arm off, and it destroyed the damn radio. And I went down to him, and a medic was with me. And we tried to pull him up, but his arm had been severed completely, and the kid died. And it's still, right now, I see this kid. This was the first one I'd ever seen ever getting killed. I don't know who he was from. I never knew what his name was or anything. But the medic and myself pulled him up. As we started to pull him up, another shell burst, and I caught mine in my left leg. And the medic also got hit in his arm, but we still managed to pull him up to the berm, and we hid under the berm. And that's where I spent the night, in the berm, okay? And that was it. That was my D-Day.
While they were shooting right there in front of that berm. I dragged out a cigarette. I had a waterproof cigarette holder. Put it in my mouth. My matches were wet. I could see to the back of me there was a soldier. So I hollered, "Hey, buddy, have you got a match?" No answer. I turned and looked, and there was no head under the helmet. It probably saved my life to turn. It's like the soul of that guy said, "Get up and get out of here now."
Those stories are kind of crazy. And that's just like a tiny taste, right, of what some of those soldiers experienced on that day. The incredible violence that they saw, right, in real life. This is real stories. This is a real thing. We tend to just disconnect from it because we didn't have, a lot of or really any recordings of the up-close violence of what these men saw with their own eyes, what they were traumatized by. And the opening of Saving Private Ryan really gives us a glimpse. Now, let's watch this short clip from Spielberg talking about his intention behind making this film.
Saving Private Ryan was never meant to be thrilling. It was never meant to be an adventure. It was meant to be a recreation, a kind of a documentation of the closest I could get to the experiences of those who fought there on June 6th. So there was a lot of research that went into the recreation of that landing from the actual kids who landed. And Stephen Ambrose, had written a tremendous book about D-Day, another book about citizen soldiers. And he was, I think, the foremost, he was the first writer, the first biographer that really got into the DNA of a combat veteran. And really, to this day, is the father, I think, of all the combat veterans in America today. And I really felt that all the research that we did really brought that scene to life, because it was ugly, because it was honest. And it had to be ugly, because that's the way it was. And I kept fearing that I was making it so ugly the film would never be able to get into a movie theater in America. It would be labeled NC-17 and nobody would ever see it. And I was hoping upon hope that the historic relevance of that landing on that day, which basically saved Western democracy, Western civilization was saved that day by these kids that landed on June 6th. I was hoping that would allow younger people to come to a movie that would certainly be rated R, but I think had more to it than just the exploitation of World War II.
So with everything that he said, with everything I've talked about up to this point, with the idea of what, Saving Private Ryan as a film really did for the culture and really did to understand what war was, we also have to consider when it came out. Like, there wasn't war movies like Saving Private Ryan back when this film came out. What he said in that little clip, he said it's because it was real and because it was honest, right? That's what I want to dig into a little bit, because I want to ask a question about where is your moral code when it comes to violence specifically. Now, we could get into all of the questions as either a film viewer, which the majority of everyone is, people watch movies, they watch shows, or a filmmaker who makes stories on the film format. As an art form, where's your moral code when it comes to showing violence in a story? Because, there's like movies that's coming out right now, Final Destination, that if I'm being honest, look, I know people like certain films like this, but when I'm watching it, I'm honestly sickened, not because of how grotesque it all is, but I'm really sickened by the heart behind not just creating, but watching a film like that. And it's a big violation of my moral code personally. And let me explain my moral code, and then I'll get into a little bit why I think you should also define your moral code, both as a viewer and a potential filmmaker yourself, if you're watching this. So my moral code when it comes to violence specifically in stories, and I'm not innocent, I've watched films that I feel like I shouldn't have or didn't want to after I finished the film. But my moral code is based very much in my faith. So I am a Christian, I'm a believer in Jesus, and so I believe that God created us not only in his image, but he created us with value, that we're wonderfully made, and the human body is something that is special, is something that is more than just flesh and bone. It is something that is a gift to us. And it's to be respected because God created us with value. So when I approach a film, I will analyze it from this way to decide whether I thought it was a good watch, whether I decide I turn it off, whether I decide I wouldn't recommend it, or I would. I say, I think violence neither needs to be stifled nor amplified past what the story requires. And I think that's especially true when you're dealing with a story like Saving Private Ryan that's based on a true event. At least the beginning of the film is based on a true event. When I see movies like Final Destination, or for example, that comedy, kind of violent comedy film called Cocaine Bear that I watched and I didn't enjoy it at all. In fact, I was really upset with myself that I watched it because I kind of knew what it was going to be before I went into it. The idea of disrespecting not just the human body, but the human life, right? When violence, especially gruesome violence, becomes kind of a joke, or becomes disrespected in some manner, the human body becomes disrespected because of violent acts that's done on it on screen or in a story. If you are telling a very sobering story that involves violence, by all means, use it to the extent it motivates the story and gets your point across. But once it becomes a humor device, or once it feels disrespectful or passive or without value, that's when I start to have a real issue with the violence that I see in films. And so for me personally, I am perfectly fine with violent films like Saving Private Ryan. I'm perfectly fine even with certain seasons of Game of Thrones when you're telling a story that is violent, even though it's in a fantasy world, but it gets your point across as to the brutality of the world that we're telling the story in. But once it becomes a joke, or once it starts to feel disrespectful and that the sobering reality of losing a life or the damage that's done to the human body sort of becomes a passive thing, that I feel like that violates the moral code, because violence is always serious in the real world. It's a very saddening, serious, sobering thing when violence is done to the human body. And so I'm okay with it in stories. I'm very okay with it. I've done it in stories, but I will only use it in a very real, sobering manner. So that's kind of the foundations where I have. And I think actually building a moral code or a moral foundation for yourself, either as someone who watches films or someone who makes films professionally or casually in the indie market or whatever, I think entertainment should be emotional expression and principled foundation of the storyteller, right? When you have just one emotional expression, you can be led into all kinds of really strange, wacky places that I don't think are very great. And then if you just have principled or moral foundation brought into a story, it could become very stale, become very boring, very one-dimensional and preachy, right? So it's a combination of the two that really allows a journey of emotional curiosity. And I think as a storyteller, you kind of have to have that defined. And so whether you watch films just for entertainment, whether you watch films because you're a complete nerd over films and you've never thought about where are kind of my morality codes for my viewing behaviors, or if you're a filmmaker or a writer and you tell stories, what are your morality kind of guidelines to help you write stories that don't violate your moral code? I think that is extremely ethical. I think it's a very principled and wise thing for storytellers to pay attention to and to implement. And it's something that I think we probably as a culture need to really consider and really need to put into practice. Culture 100% is shaped by art. And so what type of art do you watch? What type of art do you create? That's a very valid question for you to ask yourself. And what matters to you define that and let your art reflect that, right? Not necessarily be a carbon copy of a message that you're trying to get out into the world, but at least create guidelines so that your storytelling does not violate those principled guidelines that you hold close. And I know everyone's line is different, and I'm not trying to say you should adopt mine. Let me know what thoughts you have in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts around Saving Private Ryan as a film, and or this idea of creating those moral boundaries, right, in storytelling. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Like this video if you found it valuable, if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel to see more videos just like this.